Accountability is not the same thing as punishment. Punishment is about imposing a penalty, whereas accountability is about making the standard real.
If you're saying somebody's lazy, that seems something that doesn't come with a solution. You are lazy. Well, okay, I guess I'm just lazy. Whereas the other approach seems to be like, this is one instance where you didn't meet the standard. This is what we expect to happen next time.
Welcome to Science of Leadership, where we talk about what it really takes to lead people well, not through slogans or tricks, but through principles grounded in research, experience, and the realities of working with human beings. I'm Tom Collins, and I'm joined by my friend and co-host, Justin Hamrick. Today, we're beginning a two-part conversation on holding people accountable. In part one, we'll focus on what accountability is, why leaders avoid it, and why the cost of avoidance so often falls on the people already carrying the most. In part two, we'll bring in the research and talk through a practical framework for having these conversations well. Justin, today we're talking about something leaders often say they believe in, but many of us struggle pretty mightily to do well. That's holding people accountable.
That's one of those phrases everybody agrees with until they're the one that has to initiate or make the conversation.
Yeah, no doubt. It sounds simple from a distance. Then you're sitting across from somebody, somebody you like or someone you know who's going to get defensive, someone who's been in the organization for years. And suddenly there's this accountability that feels much more complicated. I think leaders often struggle for a couple reasons. One's obvious. They don't want to have the difficult conversation. They see this shortcoming, but they don't know what to do about the situation or, the discomfort, naming it, calling it out. And the second is more uncomfortable for leaders to admit. Sometimes they never made the standard clear in the first place. And that was so important. So by the time they want to hold someone accountable, the person may not actually even know what success was supposed to look like in the first place.
So part of the problem may be the person's performance, just something they did, something they messed up. But part of it can be what's wrong with many relationships, right? Is unclear expectations or a lack of clarity from the leader.
Yeah. I think that has to be the starting point, really. Before accountability becomes a conversation about someone else's failure, I think it's incumbent on us as the leader to ask, did I make the standard clear? If the answer is no, then the first move isn't to be frustrated with the other person. It's not punishment. It's not blame. The first move should be for us to reset, to recalibrate, to go back to what should the expectation be. Let's set that out.
Well, and that the expectation, not only what it was, but was it stated? Did you just imply it? Or did you actually give them the standard that you're going to hold them to? To do that seems both fair and a practical place to start with all this.
You're right. It is. It is fair. And it is practical. And it's something we just fail to do so often. We expect people to know what our expectations are. I remember Admiral Snuffy Smith telling me, if you don't tell people what you expect of them, you won't get it. And that is so elementary, but it's so vitally important because we fail. So I think it's, something we have to do. Another thing that we got to think about as we're talking about this is that accountability is not primarily about being nice. It's starting with the standard. People accept roles. They join teams. They take on work. And when they do that, they make commitments. They make commitments to the work, to the mission, to the people. And those people are counting on them to get their job, their part of the job done, right? So when someone doesn't do the work that they've agreed to, it's not that they just create this incomplete task. It shifts the burden. It erodes the trust. It asks other people to absorb that responsibility, that duty, that cost. And that's why I think accountability is really an act of leadership and responsibility. It's how leaders help people honor the commitments that they've made to the work, to the mission, and to the team.
And when the leaders don't do that, the work still has to go somewhere. Like if you haven't made the expectations, the standard, whatever you want to call it, extremely clear, then it's going to fall on the shoulders of someone else. Someone else is going to have to do it.
You're exactly right. The work doesn't just vanish, it doesn't disappear. It may get delayed, it may get neglected, it may get done poorly, but often it ends up being handed to someone else. And very often that someone else is the high performer, right? I mean, it's the person everyone knows will get the job done. That's one of the reasons this episode, what we're talking about, matters so much, because of the repercussions of failing to keep people accountable. Accountability is not only about correcting underperformance, it's also about protecting those people who are already carrying the organization. So today we're going to talk about what accountability is, why leaders avoid it, why it matters so much, and how to do it in a way that is clear, direct, humane, and responsible. Justin, when you hear the phrase holding people accountable, what do you think many leaders hear?
I think sort of twofold. I think probably not the second one we talked about, but really the first one. I think it is some type of discipline, some punishment, some correction of bad behavior. Not that the task wasn't accomplished, but it wasn't done in the right way. I think they, especially in medicine, they imagine someone get written up, some, whatever you want to call it in your organization, some safety report comes out and they didn't do something correctly. Somebody got mad at them. They get called out. They get put on a performance plan or maybe even fired. Like that's what sort of comes to mind, that sort of uncomfortable correction of behavior that we mentioned.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that's why so many leaders hesitate to hold people accountable. Accountability has started to have this connotation of being punitive, right? But accountability is not the same thing as punishment. Punishment is about imposing a penalty, whereas accountability is about making the standard real. It's saying, this is what the role requires. This is what we agreed to. This is what the team needs. This is what the work demands. And we have to be honest about whether that's happening.
So accountability is not what happens after somebody fails. Like it seems to be like a clear delineation of expectations, the standard, the objectives, and where that person or persons might have fallen short from it.
Right. And that's a huge part of our discussion today that I think I want our listeners to really home in on, is that accountability isn't just an after the fact sort of thing. And it's not just about the person that needs to be held accountable. It's so much about the leader. There is accountability before the fact, and there is accountability after the fact. And accountability before the fact is about clarity. It's the leader saying, hey, here's the standard. Here's what is expected. This is what success looks like. Here is how we will know whether we are meeting it. Here's when we will follow up on that. And accountability after is follow through. It's the leader saying, hey, here's this gap, this shortcoming. This is why it matters that's a shortcoming. Here's what needs to change. Here's the support that we have available to help with that change. Here's what happens if that gap continues. If we only think about accountability sort of ex post facto, after something has gone wrong, we're way too late.
It also doesn't seem to focus on some shortcoming of the person, like something that they don't have. It seems to make accountability feel less like a reaction to some behavior and more like a part of leading the work. Like, this is how we're going to go forward with this team. Hey, maybe I wasn't clear. This is the expectation we have. Remember, we discussed this. This is where I see your part in it falling short of that. This is how we're going to be better tomorrow as a team. Like, this is how we're going to lead the work.
It's creating a framework or the conditions for success for the individual, for your team, for the mission. It's setting that all up on the front end. And again, we're so, in my experience, so terribly poor at doing that, right? But this accountability connects to one of the principles from the 4 stars of leadership. And that is, great leaders never walk by a problem. When somebody's not doing their job, that's a problem. And if you choose to walk by it, that's a leadership failure. Not to mention the fact that it's a leadership failure for us to not set the expectations. But if you identify the problem and you choose to walk by it, when you see that gap between the standard and reality, you can't ignore it, because when you do, you've lowered the standard. That's a really important part of this. Now, when you see that gap, you shouldn't detonate over it. Don't embarrass somebody, publicly. You want to praise in public, correct in private, but don't pretend like it isn't there either. Address it early, directly, constructively. Again, when you see a problem, address it. Let me pause here for a second and remind our listeners that my book, The 4 Stars of Leadership, is now available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and essentially all online outlets. It's getting rave reviews, and I'm certain you will find it not only informative, but also inspiring. So I hope you'll order your copy today. Now let's get back to this interesting conversation.
Well, there's got to be times where people just need grace, right? They're having a bad week. It's unlike them. Something that happens at home. They miss something they would normally not miss, or their behavior seems out of the norm for them. Is that the same thing? Like, do we have to address everything? Like, when do we know what to do?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question, a really good and important point, because grace matters. We're talking about, I think, grace is, you said, hey, they had an off week. Baseball, maybe you have a couple of bad games, you're just not hitting the ball. Okay, you don't get traded because of that, right? Like, hey, we're just having a bad week. Good teams need space to be human, to screw up a little bit now and then, right? But grace and avoidance are different. Grace says this person had a bad day, messed up on this one thing, or this person's facing something unusual, or this was a mistake they're willing to learn from. Avoidance, on the other hand, is, hey, this is a pattern. I keep seeing this coming up, and everyone knows it's happening repeatedly, and the standard is still not being met, and I keep finding reasons not to address it. That's avoidance. That's not grace. That's the leader walking by that problem.
You mentioned earlier, it's not about blame. It's not about calling people out. But obviously, grace is not avoidance. It's not addressing it. Or like you were saying, rationalizing it in your mind. Oh, they're having an off week. I don't need to address this. Even if it is a one-time occurrence, probably still need to address that. But how do you separate those two, the accountability and blame? Because they tend to overlap. And I think that's a lot of what we were talking about earlier. This is why leaders avoid it, because maybe they're friends with these colleagues. Maybe they're very close and they don't want to blame them. And so it's really easy to sort of rationalize it. But how do we separate those two?
Yeah, I think the leader who is blaming asks, whose fault is this? The leader who's trying to hold somebody accountable says, or asks, what standard have we missed? What needs to change? What do we need to do next to make sure that this is improved? That can sound like a small distinction, but it changes the whole conversation. Blame, and we've all experienced this, blame becomes personal. Accountability is typically specific, and it's more directed at action than personal. When somebody says, you're lazy, you did this because you're lazy, that's personal, right? You're unreliable. A leader who is trying to hold somebody accountable doesn't say that. They say, hey, look, the last 3 reports that you put together came in after the deadline that we had established, and that delayed everybody else on the team. So instead of saying you're not a team player, the leader says, hey, in these last 2 meetings, you interrupted several people, and afterward they told me that they didn't feel like they were able to contribute. So I think that that's a way that we can distinguish between blame and accountability.
It seems like you name the behavior or the outcome, but not a character flaw. Like you're trying to separate, this is something innate about you, which really sort of almost tells me, like, if you're saying somebody's lazy, that seems something that doesn't come with a solution. You are lazy. Well, okay, I guess I'm just lazy. Whereas the other approach seems to be like, this is one instance where you didn't meet the standard, which almost really just flows into, this is what we expect to happen next time.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, accountability should name the shortcoming, not attack the person. If I walk in and say, you're lazy, or you're selfish, or you're incompetent, I may be expressing my frustration with you, but I'm probably not helping you improve, right? You're going to be defensive. You're not going to listen. It's just not going to be helpful. But if I can say, hey, here's what happened. Here's the standard. Here's the gap. Here's why it matters. When we can do that, we can lay that out. Then, as you say, we have something that we can work on. Here's something that we can improve. We can get better. Whereas blame doesn't offer a solution, just as you pointed out.
Blame seems to go more towards, I guess, the conclusion of the actions. Like you're almost assigning some character trait that you believe is the result of those actions. Well, they didn't turn in these 3. Well, you must be then inherently lazy. It's almost like this leap of assumption that you have to make to go to blame to do that.
Yeah, it's the fundamental attribution error. We only have the data we have. And so if somebody does this 3 times in a row, it's because they're incompetent, not because, they have these other things going on. Yeah, so exactly. Thinking about the kinds of accountability gaps that there are, I think we could name at least 3. And the first is a performance gap, right? The work's not being done at the expected level. It may be late, incomplete, inaccurate, whatever the case may be. So that performance gap. And those of us who've spent a lot of our lives in training, I think we tend to focus on that. Like we've come in the system, and that's a place where we might get caught up. The second is a behavior gap. The way the person's working is creating problems for other people. They may be dismissive, disruptive, defensive, passive-aggressive, unreliable, incooperative, whatever it may be. And the third is a values violation. And I think this is a different one, right? Like these are legal, ethical, moral, professional standards that we can't tolerate, that we don't, that on the front end, I don't think we should have to spell out, hey, look, welcome to our team. Around here, we don't lie, cheat, steal, murder, go through the list, right? Extort.
That's in the mission statement.
Right. Like you shouldn't have to spell that stuff out. That group of values violation, if you will, that should be something that people know. And if they don't, you probably don't want to hire them in the first place. But the other two, performance and behavior, that's where we see a lot of issues when it comes to holding people accountable.
So if the expectation was unclear, you can reset it. Repeat your standard, your expectations. But if somebody violates an obvious ethical or professional line, then like you said, that's not a clarity problem. This is not something we should have to spell out. Like any company, most companies would have that as like, listen, this is our bottom foundation of what we consider to be a good human. That doesn't need to be spelled out.
Yeah, if someone falsifies documentation, mistreats a patient, harasses a colleague, behaves dishonestly, we don't need to say, well, maybe I should have been clearer. As you say, some standards are foundational. I'm having this flashback to when I was in medical school, and one of the students in our class like detonated on rounds and started kicking another student like that. What? Like really, like aggressively. Hey, we got another line of work for you. It's not in medicine, right? Many accountability problems are not that clean. They're ordinary but meaningful gaps. Someone's missing deadlines. They're not following through. They're causing problems with other people, failing to carry their share of the weight. In those situations, we have to examine our own clarity. Have we been clear before we move to correct folks on things? I think leaders commonly fail with regards to this, accountability concept in three ways. As I was just hitting on, the first is failure of clarity. As I said, people can't meet a standard they haven't been told or don't understand. We got to make that clear. The second is a failure of courage. This is a hard one. The leader identifies the shortcoming, but avoids the conversation. I can't tell you how many times I've seen that. The third is a failure of follow through. The leader talks about the standard, but nothing changes because there are never consequences.
Some of these seem to have gray areas almost, where maybe your own work ethic would be one way, or your own standard, and maybe there's two ways to do it. But if you really want to create a culture, if you really want to create a standard that is exceptional, the third one seems to be where teams learn what the real standard is. Well, okay, well, I guess, how they did it's fine. I wouldn't want, as the leader, for them to have done it like this. I think our standard is here. But if you ignore that one, you are indirectly telling them what the real standard is, because what you allow is the standard. Right. And if you tell a standard or mention a culture, but you never return to it, you didn't set a standard. You made a suggestion. And teams notice that. They know whether real deadlines matter, whether real sort of expectations are, where professionalism matters, or what the quality of their work means. They know whether one person can keep falling short while the high performers end up having to keep up the slack for them. And over time, that team learns what the leader actually tolerates instead of what they actually say.
Especially then. Yeah. If the leader says the right things, but tolerates the opposite, those words are hollow. The message becomes, the standard is optional, or, hey, some people don't have to carry their share. Or, hey, if you're dependable, if you get the job done, we're going to load you up with more. That just breaks people down, makes them feel disrespected. It makes them feel like they're being mistreated. It's a really negative situation, all because perhaps the leader's too chicken to actually hold somebody accountable who's not meeting the standard.
It's interesting. I think with any boundary, and I don't mean to say that people on teams are like children, but in a lot of things, parenting and leadership have some very similar traits. And if I tell my kids that this is the standard, this is how we're going to behave, this is how things will occur in the house, but there is no consequence to when they do it, then was it really the standard? It's like a dog with an invisible fence. If they are running towards where you've put up these little flags and are saying where this invisible fence is, and there's no consequence, there's no checking as they get close to it or cross it, then what are they to learn? Well, the fence isn't actually here. The boundary isn't here. The expectation is not here. In every relationship I've ever known, unclear expectations are almost always at the center of why it fails. Just unclear communication. And I think that's what really matters. But let me push on from this from the perspective of the leader who is uncomfortable with accountability, because I do agree that that's one of the really failures in this. It's not usually recognition that the standard wasn't achieved or that, I didn't even know that it's more of, I've got to do something about it. And a lot of people get into leadership positions because they are likable.
Yeah.
They are people pleasers. And this really goes right into the face of that trait. They may say, well, I'm not trying to be harsh. I don't want to rock the boat. I don't want to hurt the person. I don't want to damage that relationship. But avoidance of establishing that is so detrimental.
Yeah. I mean, I can understand wanting to be the nice guy, right? I mean, you want people to like you, and that can be a tremendous trap, if you will, for leaders sometimes. I can certainly understand that. These kind of conversations, I've had to have a number of them. They can be awful. You don't look forward to them. They can make you anxious. They can make you feel guilty. You may worry about, how's this other person going to take this? Are they going to be embarrassed? Are they going to be defensive? How are they going to act? And if you're not exquisitely careful, you can really damage that relationship. So I don't want to minimize the emotional, psychological burden of this situation we're talking about, but discomfort's not proof that the conversation is wrong. Your feelings about the conversation shouldn't be your guide. Sometimes discomfort is simply the cost of responsible leadership. Avoiding accountability, it may feel kind in the moment. I think that a lot of times we tell ourselves that.
Yeah, that's how we rationalize
being kind
it, right?
here, by not holding them to the standard. But I think the reality is it's exactly the opposite. It's deeply unkind. It's unkind to the person because you let them keep failing without telling them the truth. It's unkind to the team because you allow one person's failure to become everyone else's burden. And it's unkind to the mission because everybody, the work, everything you're trying to accomplish suffers because this person isn't doing their job.
I think that's a really true point that most of us probably avoid in trying to be kind or avoiding hard conversations or avoiding the meat of feedback. It's actually unkind. It doesn't, like we've said before, we want to be better tomorrow than we are today. You're keeping that from them. If a person's drowning and you're the only person that sees them drowning, are you not going to throw them a life preserver? And that's a hard but important distinction. Avoidance can feel like grace or mercy, but it actually isn't. And when leaders avoid accountability, they're not being neutral. They're actually declaring something. They're transferring the consequences of their avoidance onto other people. And most often the burden lands on the people who are already doing the most, what you call the high performers. Accountability protects the people who are meeting the standard because the work is still there. Like you said, the work is still there. And especially if the person not meeting the standard is affecting others, their poor behavior, their not meeting the standard of the work, them doing just enough where everyone else is excelling and your standard is excelling. That really hurts the team. And like we said before, what you're telling the rest of the team is, I'm okay with this. Right. I'm okay with the very bottom because not addressing it, not dealing with it, and I'm not asking any more than that.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I'm hoping to do here in our conversation is to shift the mindset from worrying specifically about this one person, how they're going to feel, right? To think about all the other people that they're negatively impacting. And what are you doing to those people by, allowing that to happen? Start shifting the mindset to how do we protect those people who are meeting the standard? Because accountability is not only about the person who's missing the standard, it's about the people who are meeting it. If that one person consistently fails to do their part, someone else is going to compensate. Someone else stays late. They double check the work. They repair the relationship. They calm the family, the customer, the patient, the colleague, whoever it may be. Someone else carries the stress. And at some point, that person starts to wonder, why am I working so hard in a system that does not protect me when this other person is not living up to their end of the deal? And then that person ends up deciding perhaps they'll go elsewhere.
Yeah, or that they're like, why am I working so hard? Like, I'm just going to do what they do.
Yeah,
and so now,
mediocre too.
Exactly. Now you've gotten everyone to come down to that. And that's very real in medicine. There are always people who become the workaround. Everyone knows they will get it done, so the system keeps leaning on them. And if you allow people to do what you don't think is enough, then the other people, the people that, quote unquote, have a better work ethic, and they're going to keep shouldering it. But you're absolutely right. You're only damaging those high performers, because they're going to look around and be like, I'm not getting paid anymore. Why am I doing so much more work? Their own character will only take them so far.
Yeah. I mean, it is in a sense a form of exploitation. I'm reminded of, I may have shared this on a previous episode, I'm not sure, but when I was a third year medical student, I was doing my surgery rotation. A lot of nights I just slept at the hospital because the apartment was so far from the hospital. I needed to be there so early, and I was there so late that I would just stay at the hospital even when I wasn't on call. And there were other students on surgery rotation who would not answer the pager in the middle of the night when they were on call. Instead of correcting that, they would call me. The surgery residents would call me because they knew I would answer even when I wasn't on call. And so I was up all hours of the night, multiple days, nights in a row, holding retractors and all the terrible stuff that you do when you're on surgery rotation as a medical student, because I would answer the page, because I was holding up above the standard. And so, I was exploited in a real sense. Meanwhile, the underperformers are fast asleep in the call room, and nobody wants to deal with that problem, all that goes with that. And over time, when those sorts of things happen, the high performer decides, I'm leaving. The organization gets weaker. The people who get things done get burnt out and they leave. And the people who don't get things done stay. That's one of the reasons that accountability has this sense of a moral weight to me. It's not just a management technique. It's a way of protecting those commitments of your team and your organization. Justin, can you think of a time in medicine when someone wasn't held accountable early enough and the consequences became much larger than they needed to be?
Not just one, like you said. I think medicine, like many things, has a lot of people-pleasing high performers. And if they see a deficit, they will just do it. One repeated example seems to come to mind where we may have a number of cases in pediatric anesthesia that need to be done. And maybe someone is up for it. It's their turn to sort of do a longer, more difficult case. And they complain and they delay. And it ends up that someone else that wasn't their turn ends up doing it. And most of the time it's because, the person assigned it knows they won't complain. They know they'll just get the job done. And it is so detrimental because twofold. One, you're telling the person who is the high performer, you are going to do more than your share of work. This is not equitable. Because we know you are a strong worker, we're going to give you more of it with no more reward. And what it's telling the low performer is that bad behavior, that not meeting the standard, will be rewarded with what you want.
Yeah.
Which is not addressing that you're not meeting the standard. And in both cases, I believe it is absolutely catastrophic. I know we'll get to this later, but in our practical, this really is going to diverge from parenting. There is a relationship in a parent over a child that has some assumption of this person's growing, this person's developing. I think what we're going to really get into in the practical part of these conversations is most of the time these are adults.
Yeah.
These are adults that, maybe mid or late in their career.
Who still act like children, though.
And how do we give feedback to those? Like, how do we approach that? And I've seen teams fall apart because that type of work that didn't meet the standard wasn't addressed. And most of the time it becomes, well, that's just who they are, meaning the low performer. Yeah. Like everybody just says it. Oh, that's just who they are. Oh, they just do that. And it's just sort of swept away when it is a toxic culture killer. It is a team killer.
Yeah. And it just grows over time, right? Like you're reinforcing their bad behavior, just like you said. You're piling more on these other people. People get frustrated. You lose, as a leader, you lose all credibility. Eventually, people don't listen to anything you have to say. So, and the longer we wait, the harder that it gets to have that conversation.
I'm struck by how important this is, how important it is for leaders to get this right. Not only if they do it, but how they do it. So why do so many leaders and organizations avoid these conversations?
That's the question every leader has to face, because by this point, I think most of us would agree that accountability matters. We know the work does not disappear. We know the burden often lands on the high performers. We know the team is watching what the leader tolerates. And yet, even good leaders still avoid these conversations. So why is that? Why do capable, thoughtful, well-intentioned leaders walk by problems they know they need to address? And what happens inside a team when they do? That's where we'll pick up in part 2. We'll look at the psychology of avoidance, the organizational barriers that make accountability harder, the research on tolerated underperformance and turnover, and then we'll give you a practical framework for having the conversation you may have been avoiding. Because avoiding accountability may feel kind in the moment, but as we'll see in part 2, it often becomes one of the most unkind things a leader can do. Remember, leadership is about helping those we lead do great things. It's a journey of continual growth and learning. When we embrace that journey with curiosity, courage, and humility, we can confront challenges, overcome barriers, and foster environments where everyone can succeed. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to follow or subscribe, leave a comment, and share the episode with others who are passionate about leadership. Until next week, keep leading with character, competence, caring, and communication. This is Tom Collins. Let's keep growing.